Father, is it true that Pope St. Pius X wanted only males to sing in church choirs because he considered them to be performing a clerical function?
Yes, it is true. Yes, it is considered that the Schola Cantorum, coming out of the earliest days of the church, where they would sing in unison the psalms and so on, was a male phenomenon. Now, one has to be a bit careful here because, there are communities of men who gathered together and they would sing the praises of God in the psalms and so on. They would come to, in the early churches, to be known as the Schola Cantorum, okay, the choir of singers, I guess you'd call it, the school of singers, cantors. If you go to Rome, go to the Basilica of San Clemente, the Via di San Giovanni in Laterano. It joins the Lateran Basilica with the Colosseum. It goes between the two of them. You'll come to an indiscreet, or I should nondescript, I should say rather, door off the sidewalk there and enter into an 11th century basilica. And if you take the steps down into through the sacristy, you're going down to the level of the 4th century basilica down below. The 11th century basilica was built on top of the 4th century basilica. And if you keep walking down the steps, you'll come to a 1st century Roman villa, basically. A part of Rome that was destroyed by Nero's fire in the 1st century, 64 AD or so, right? And there's a lot of history there. But what is most interesting about that, it is the most ancient surviving form of the early Roman basilica. Even in the 11th century structure, what you're looking at are the appointments that stood in the 4th century basilica. When the 4th century basilica became unstable, they took everything out of it, filled it in, made a foundation on which to build the 11th century basilica. And then they took back into the basilica of the 11th century all of the furnishings of the earlier basilica. So you see the Schola Cantorum in marble. You see where they sat to sing and where they stood at the ambos there, at the lecterns, to sing the divine praises in the divine office. And it's before the sanctuary. And the baldacchino, the little modest baldacchino there over the altar, those appointments go back to the earliest centuries. So the idea of the male choir and the men gathering there to sing the praises of God goes back very, very early in the church. You go back into the Bible and you read about the apostles at the Last Supper, how they prayed, and how when they finished the Last Supper, they sang a hymn to God together, and then went with our Lord to the Garden of Gethsemane. This was the way they did things. It was very common, it was perfectly understood, acceptable, a standard operating procedure in those days for them to sing the praises and glories of God. And Christians to meet and do so. Now women, well, yes, St. Jerome had a big role to play in the 300s. This is after Constantine, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the Edict of Milan, okay. In the middle of the 300s, St. Jerome actually did gather the noble women. Some of these were noble women of Rome who were very wealthy. And they had such a respect for him that they actually parted with their wealth and went to Palestine with him when he left Rome. And they wanted to form a spiritual community, a religious community, and they did. And perhaps the earliest religious community of women actually was started around under the auspices of St. Jerome. And of course they would sing the divine office too, and very beautifully, no doubt, just as the sisters today sing the divine office, and the seminarians and the brothers and monks in the monasteries have sung the divine office for centuries and centuries and centuries. At Tongerlo in Belgium, one of the great monasteries of the religious order that I used to belong to, the Norbertines, Premonstratensians, I understand they had 200 religious in solemn vows who would meet multiple times every day in the church, and they would sing the entire office, not the entire Premonstratensian office, the divine office, but they would sing the office of the dead for the souls of the deceased, and also the little office of Our Blessed Lady. That's what I understand, every day. It was the warp and woof of their lives. It conduced to create a very, very lively and like an all-pervasive spiritual atmosphere of well-being and joy and contentment. There are stories about what happened after Vatican II, when that singing of the divine office was actually squelched in religious communities, and the religious communities simply disintegrated. And no doubt the squelching of the divine office and the divine praises actually was a lead contributor to the disintegration of the religious life. So it really was the heart and soul, you might say, of the religious life. Even under St. Augustine, after St. Jerome, again, priests gathered around him when he was a bishop, I think even before he was a bishop. They gathered around and they would sing the divine praises. And that was like the center of their lives, their communal lives together, is getting together to sing the praises and the glories and thanks to God. And because this was primarily a man thing, at least as far as the records show, it's a very Catholic thing to do. Is there something wrong with the female voice? No, there's nothing wrong with the female voice. Although one might say, well, why would St. Pius X manifestly prefer the male choir, right? Well, because again, as it said in the question here, he considered that to be such, let's say, an integral part of divine worship, that he considered it to be actually a form of serving, an extension of the service at the altar, the singing of the divine praises to God, the hymns at Mass, was considered to be a clerical, something that the clergy would do. And the clergy were men. So he indicates, properly speaking, it would be men and men's voices that are singing in the church. Now, the church has allowed that as she spread, and as churches were put up, built, and clergy were spread more and more thinly, as it were, that, yes, worthy female voices could sing too. Even there, though, the church actually gave pride of place to the voices of the young children, the boys. We're talking about 7, 8, 9-year-old children, like the the Sistine Chapel Choir, the Vienna Boys Choir, kind of an outgrowth of that. So they needed the higher registers, and they had the boys sing. But it was because it was considered to be basically an extension of the clergy to sing, okay? If it gets down to the question of, well, why aren't women allowed to be clergy? Okay, that's another question, okay? But the fact is, that is why they preferred the male voice, because it was considered to be kind of the proper function of the clergy of the church to sing the praises of God during the divine worship.